Hey, welcome back to Todd's podcast. And folks, we're going to try something a little bit different today. We're going to do a small series called Generally Speaking, where we've got a couple of the Two Blue Aces senior consultants. And we're going to be talking about some military issues, some things that they've got some insight in, and some topics that they're going to talk about and share and let us know a little bit more about what's going on in the world, we hope. I appreciate them coming in. General Rob Mumbles Polumbo, F-16 pilot, active and reserve, and flew in the military 30 plus years. And he actually drove up from Boca to get here today, to be here live. So I appreciate the effort on your part, Mumbles. And Dick Beef Haddad, came over, got out of his physical therapy a little bit early, feeling good, feeling spry. So we'll see how jumpy he gets this morning. But came over from Tampa, and appreciate you coming over. We're going to try this live. We've got 2 or 3 of these episodes that we've got planned, and Beef and Mumbles are going to be our sacrificial lambs, and we're going to see how it goes. So hopefully you will enjoy it. Hopefully it'll be something that you want to hear more of, and that we'll get a couple of the other aces for a couple other episodes coming up. And so I want to thank you both, Mumbles, Beef. Thank you for making the effort to get over here today to Lakeland. And when this idea first came up, it was some of the things I want to talk about. Maybe they weren't appropriate. We talked about some topics. So I think we've got some stuff today that I think people will find interesting, and to have your specific spin on them. You both did active duty, and you were also in the reserves, and you also flew airlines for a living in your later part of your life, and you're both retired. So Beef's got a couple of years on you, Mumbles, but I think he'd win a beauty contest if we actually had to put him up in the Miss Florida pageant. So
I don't know about that.
So
Hey, can I start off with
absolutely
just a quick story?
Sure.
1980, I met this fellow Beef. I went to the Air Force Academy. My brother and he were 81 grads,
Yep.
and I was an 84 grad. So when I came in, they were seniors. And so my brother told all of his buddies to come by and see Brother Rob and welcome him to the Air Force Academy. So we were called doolies when you're a freshman, which is slave. And so we weren't treated very well. And the first door that came through or knocked open the door was this gargantuan guy, 6'4", 275, offensive tackle for the Air Force Falcons. Probably the biggest guy that had ever played for the Falcons in that time. And I looked at him and I go, oh my God. And he goes, hey, your brother told me to come on by. And I go, okay, good to meet you, sir. And the next thing I know, he's got me on the ground in a pretzel, beating the crap out of me and then laying on me. And I go, oh my gosh. I said, what squadron are you in, sir? He goes, this one. And I'm going to see you every day. And I go, oh my gosh. So
Yeah.
he would get his warm up, getting ready for football practice, come and beat on me a little bit.
Well, just think what he'd have done to the other guys on the other side of the line if he had not taken out a little bit of his piss and vinegar on you. Beef, you got anything to say to that?
Not much to say about
Welcome
that.
to the Air Force Academy,
welcome
young
to the
man.
Air Force Academy. And we've been friends ever since.
Yeah.
And he and his brother and I have been friends for, 40 years now.
44.
44 years. Yeah, it's been, and I've known General Polumbo and his brother since high school. Rob was close buds with my younger brother as I was with his older brother, and so it's good to come here. You've both been on this podcast before where we've done one-on-one, so I'm not going to go too much into your background. General Polumbo, you flew fast jets your whole life, and Beef, you flew the heavies your whole life. And so if you want to listen to their episodes, they're at todddantzler.com. Is that the best way for anyone to access them, Eli?
Or wherever you get your podcast.
Or wherever you get your podcast. Thank you for making me sound almost competent. Starting off, you hear in the news about the shortage of pilots and recruiting issues news and, some of the current programs. Can you talk about that? I mean, the stuff you hear in the news, take it with a grain of salt, obviously, I think, not just on what you guys do, but the different social stuff that's going on. But when they talk about a shortage of pilots, talk to us about, is that true? Are you guys short of pilots? Is every branch of the military short? And what can we do about it?
Yeah, that's not fake news.
Okay.
There's a global shortage of pilots, in fact, and it's not just to the military side of it, it's the commercial side as well. Almost overwhelmingly commercial, because there's vast more pilots and need for pilots in the commercial arena. So it's global, it's here to stay, and there are many reasons for that. The first one is it takes so much time and effort and money to become qualified as a pilot, and even more so to get in the commercial area. So you're talking about someone that has to, put money out front and get training in hope that they would get hired by a commercial airline. And so that's a big comeback for a lot of people, and they just don't really have the time, money, or effort, time to put that, put it out there so that they might be able to get hired. So they need to get, food on the table at night. So they get into something else that takes their efforts.
Right.
And it's very difficult to get somebody to train that long to become a pilot.
Beef?
Oh, I fully agree. When we got into the business of the airlines, it was there were a lot of military pilots that were airline pilots, and the airline was kind of the catcher's mitt for a lot of the military guys getting off.
Still wanted to fly, but get out of active duty.
Sure. That has all changed. There aren't enough military pilots to feed not only the airlines, but also the reserve and the guard. So the reserve and guard are having to train brand new guys, where in the past they were able to accept those guys that were coming off active duty. The airplanes have changed. There's not as many of them in the military. So, and the requirement for them is more technologically advanced. So these guys are, having to learn these weapon systems that are more difficult. And so the training aspects of it are harder, and it's just compound. There's a compound effect to the whole pilot training issue and the shortages that exist. When I got hired, it took me 10 years. When I started out at Trans World Airlines, it took me almost 10 years to upgrade to the left seat.
Really?
And that's how difficult it was in terms of the number of pilots that were in front of us to be able to move to the point where you could get to the left seat. Today, some of these kids are upgrading in less than 6 months. It's unbelievable.
To the left seat?
To the left seat.
That's a little harrowing to
Yeah.
hear.
Could I just get a little more specifics?
Please.
The history of this probably started back in 1978 with deregulation of the airlines.
Yeah.
Many things happened there, some good, some bad, but it basically said, we're going to not have any regulation anymore, because they used to tell you what the airline, where it could fly and all those kind of things. And, in the Reagan year there, he said, no, we're not going to regulate anymore. So everybody it was a wild, wild west. And so different airline companies came in. So the numbers increased, the requirement to have
the number of pilots needed to increase. Is that what you mean
the
by
number of airlines that came
Okay,
in, which
needs
need more pilots. Then, you had some economic meltdowns, in the 80s and 90s there as well. And then 9/11 hit. 9/11 was catastrophic for the airline industry.
Why?
Obviously, nobody wanted to fly airliners again because they thought they were going to fly them into a building. So that really...
on the pilot side, not just
the
on
airlines. The
airlines
airlines
in
went
general.
bankrupt.
Okay.
They had no passengers, not enough passengers to pay the bills. And so this cyclic, wave of, we need a whole bunch of pilots. We don't need many pilots. We need a whole bunch of pilots. Well, if you're out there looking to spend money and get a pilot qualification, you're going, it's kind of a risky industry. And so those ups and downs have been a barrier to get pilot growth on an upward glide path for a long while. It's always very cyclic. And then the increase of low-cost carriers, more bankruptcies and more bad news for people looking to get into that industry. And then the aging population of the pilots, because you don't have an influx of new, then everybody gets aged out.
Right.
And then you have to retire because the FAA requires you to by their policy. And so those policies, along with having a certain amount of hours, 1,500 hours minimum to qualify for an air transport pilot license, which you have to do commercial flying. And then COVID hits. And so it all happens again where everything's shut down. And then the airlines go, well, we can't pay all these people to stay on the payroll. So they had people do early outs and the higher pay grades, the older folks, and they dumped thousands of pilots. And now, how do you make up for that? You know, it takes twice as long once you get rid of pilots to build them back up. Sometimes 3 times as long. So we're in just and that's, you know, all these things are a perfect storm for shortage and shortages for, you know, decades to come.
Yeah, and I was an example of what he's talking about with regard to COVID. They used COVID money to pay off the higher paid pilots, the older pilots, to get rid of them. And unfortunately, I was 62 at the time. You had to be 63 to meet that qualification. They did about 2 or 3 iterations, and I was hoping they'd get to one more, and they didn't. And then after they ran out of COVID money, they still wanted to get rid of pilots, so they offered a substandard retirement, in my estimation, and I took it. So in that aspect, they kind of kicked themselves in the rear in terms of they mismanaged, as Rob mentioned. They got rid of all these older pilots, and now they're short of pilots. Now, the airlines hasn't always been that behind the times in terms of their thinking. They were, when we first started, the retirement age was 60. And they did have the forethought to think forward and think, we need to get this increased to 65 because we see in the future what's going to happen when this group of baby boomers leaves the airline industry. So they did change it to 65, and now I understand there's discussions to increase it to 67.
I would think a 67-year-old pilot with decades and decades of experience would be better than a 6-month-old pilot who is sitting in the left seat.
Well, it's funny you should say that. The FAA dictates now how old both pilots can be. And so now that's another thing the airlines have to look at of who am I pairing up to go down to Brazil tonight? You cannot have certain age because of the fact that their health is obviously a little bit more risky to have really old people. And so as you do that and continue to move that age out further and further and further, the restrictions are going to be even more onerous for airlines. And I don't know if you just saw it on the news yesterday or 2 days ago. A pilot was flying to Jackson Hole, and he had to tell the passengers that he was not qualified to land there. He just found out somehow airborne and said, we have to land over here and get a pilot that's qualified. And so you just think of all those restrictions that the FAA requires, and airlines put on different airports, all those kind of things. And now you look at how much chaos is built into the system.
So the pilot was in the air, and it was a he, I'm assuming. He was told that he couldn't land at Jackson Hole, but he could land at another airport.
Correct. Jackson Hole's a special airport, meaning it's very difficult and you need experience to go into there because there's terrain most of the time.
Did they change the requirements while he was midair, or did someone check before he took off?
He probably should have known that he wasn't qualified.
The airline said
so that would have been on the pilot for making.
Well, both the airline and the pilot. The airline, when they put you in the seat for that particular thing, they look and there's all these gates that they got to go through to make sure that they're current and qualified, and they haven't exceeded their FAA time for the month, the
Right.
week, and all those things. So the airline's primarily the one that does that. However, a pilot should know if he's cleared to go into, a special airport. So, but that's just what I'm saying. The further or more FAA policies and restrictions, the more chaos for the passengers, because there's going to be a lot more shortages because you don't have people that are qualified to go places because of possibly their age now.
Have either of you flown in Tegucigalpa?
Hundreds
Honduras?
of times. Hundreds of times.
I understand that's one of the most dangerous airports.
It is.
I would think if you could fly into there, you could fly into most
That's a
places.
special qualification airport. And only the captain can fly in there because it's all left turns and he's in the left seat and can see. And it's a visual approach into a bowl, if you will, with a 5,200 foot runway. And we put 757s, big airplanes, into there. And it was hairy. I mean, especially where there was weather in the valley. And so, these are all things that, get your attention, and everybody, flying is very safe. I mean, the airplanes are great. You got experienced folks, but, any glitch and you're going to have, some issues. And so it's a very tough industry for public, relations and those kind of things, because if anything goes wrong, it's usually death and injury.
And I'd agree that it is safe in terms of the fact that we've watched the progression through the years. As we started, the training was very stern and harsh, but there were some variations to the way this captain flew his airplane versus the next. Today, it's so standardized, and they ensure that when you go through school or a check ride or whatever the case might be, that there is a standard way of doing business and no other options are allowed. So that's why having a guy that's been in the company for 6 months is a little harrowing, as you said.
Right.
But by the same token, the standards are in place to ensure that he's doing it exactly the way the company wants him to do it.
Our church does an every other summer mission down to Honduras, and they fly into Tegucigalpa, maybe sometimes 3 years, depending on the political stuff on the ground. And my son went down there the first time, and he was 14, and I said, I will go with you if you really want me to. I'm not looking forward to it, but I will. He said no, he was fine. So I'm watching videos of the planes coming in and doing what you said. And I'm not a great flyer in the first place. So I find that amazing that you've done 100, but I would rather be flying on your plane that's done 100 than that young man or young woman who's 6 months in and says, hey, let's see if I can do this.
A good story, 23 years of flying military aircraft in combat zones all around the world. The only time I've taken ground fire is with American Airlines in a 757 going into Tegucigalpa. If you look at the videos, you can just, go on, Google it and look for American Airlines 757 going into Tegus. You'll see how low you are to the terrain as you dive for the runway and into this bowl. And I look out of the corner of my eye on the right side on one of the trips in there, and I see a pack of kids running. That's how close you are to the ground. I can see that they're kids running at the airplane, and one guy rearing back like this and throwing something. And I go, Captain, they're throwing something at us, and boom, right underneath the cockpit there. And I said, I think it was just a rock. I think, all right, just go ahead and land. And he puts it down on the ground, and it was a 2 to 3 inch big hole in the fuselage where they had thrown the rock and hit. And so that's my only ground fire in all my years of flying.
So, Beef, you flew with crews your whole life.
Correct.
And Mumbles, you flew, single seater. Was it easier for you to transition into the airline already having a crew than maybe you, Rob? Or
Well, I speak for myself, but it was an easy transition after flying a military cargo airplane
Right.
and going to the airlines, because you're managing.
Well, you were shot at a lot more than
True.
than Mumbles having rocks thrown at you,
Yeah.
not to minimize.
But you manage your crew. You're able to manage a crew,
Right.
where in a single seat you're managing yourself. And I don't know what. I'm not speaking for Rob. I'll let him speak for himself. But I imagine it was a little more of a transition for him than it was for me, going from the Air Force to the airline business.
Yeah, they call it crew resource management, CRM. And I was the worst CRM that ever came through the airlines.
Well,
I
congratulations.
could never get with the program.
Didn't play well with
I
others. Is
could
that
not,
what it was
because I
growing up,
wanted to
but it
do everything in the cockpit. I wanted to touch it and do it because that's
Right.
what I did. I was single seat.
Right.
And the captain would slap my hand, "Get your hand off that panel. That's my panel." And I just never, I really was never comfortable. And I was with the airlines for 23 years and I really didn't fit in too well.
Todd's podcast is sponsored in part by SVN Saunders Ralston Dantzler Real Estate. Since 1996, the firm has offered unrivaled brokerage services throughout Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. With over 90 expert advisors throughout the region, our team has the knowledge and resources to help clients realize their most ambitious real estate investment goals. When you choose SVN Saunders Ralston Dantzler Real Estate, you have access to a diverse suite of commercial and land services, including forestry consulting, land management, auctions, property management, commercial leasing, and negotiating conservation easements. If you're seeking to invest in land or explore commercial real estate opportunities in the Southeast, contact us today at svnsaunders.com or call 877-518-5263 to connect with an advisor today.
You had made the comment about how expensive it would be to become an airline pilot, and I'm assuming that's why they really like recruiting Air Force or military pilots, because they've already got a big chunk of that experience taken care of. Would someone like me ever just say, could I ever afford, like I get out of college, I don't know if you need a college degree or not, but if
Not anymore.
Not anymore.
They just changed it, apparently.
so I decide that as an adult, I want to be an Air Force pilot. How in the world would I ever,
Airline pilot, you mean?
airline pilot, what did I
Yeah,
say?
Air Force, yeah.
Airline pilot. How would I ever be able to afford the hours that it would take in the size airplanes?
So the way that's happening today is a lot of the airlines setting up their own schools. I have a nephew in Arizona that's trying to get into a SkyWest program, and that SkyWest, once you get into it, you have loans you're going to end up paying back, but they will make you a CFI in the organization, certified flight instructor. You build your hours, and they get you a job at either Delta, United, or one other airline. I'm not sure exactly what it is. So these schools are being set up.
So they're growing their own pilots.
They're growing their own pilots because they're not getting them from the military anymore.
And the other thing, just breaking down the details of it. Let's say you need 1,500 hours to get an ATP. We'll call it $100 a flight hour. If you rent a Cessna, an instructor, and the fuel, we'll just call it generally $100 an hour. You're looking at $150K up front, and a lot of time and effort because you just don't show
just
up.
to get the minimum.
That's the minimum
qualifications.
for air transport pilot qualification. So that's a big
So
investment.
the 80 to 90% of the airline pilots come from the military because of that. That's got to be an incredible barrier.
They used to, but the Air Force only produces, they're trying to produce 1,400 a year. They're not there yet. They're only producing a little over 1,000, 1,200 pilots a year.
New pilots.
Yes. And so that's nowhere close to what the airline industry needs.
I can't imagine it's enough that the Air Force needs either, much less the other branches
Well,
of service.
Air Force wants to have 21,000 pilots. They've always been for the last decade and a half or 2,000 short. So we're at about 19 that are active. The Navy and Marine Corps are about the same. They're about 10% shy of where they need to be. But there's really no way to gain ground on that. And we didn't go through the details of what's happened on the military side. I'll just throw out a couple.
Yeah.
Obviously, commercial hiring is a huge detraction to ever getting the roles right, the numbers in the military, because as soon as someone has 1,500 hours in the military, they can bail unless they have a commitment. And so that's what the Air Force has done. It used to be, I think, 6 years for us back in our day. Now it's 10 years. Once you go through Air Force training, you committed for 10 years. And so they've moved that out. So
Pilot training, not just Air Force. You mean Air Force?
Well, once
pilot
you
training.
finished your pilot training, you owe them 10 years
Okay.
of service. So now you have 11 years of active duty. It's kind of tough to leave when you've only got
Right.
9 years left. Get a retirement out of the way, but they are leaving, and Rob's going to go through that. They're leaving because of all these family issues and deployments and all these other things that have caused them to say, "I've had enough."
Wow.
Another big thing is because they can't produce pilots, it's primarily because they don't have instructors. All of their instructors and experienced folks are in the operational units because we got to have them in case the horn goes off and we got to go to war. And so to bring an experienced person back to a training base where they're not in the combat readiness mode is a detraction to us being able to project power across the globe. So shortage of instructors, if you don't have an instructor, you can't train new pilots, right? The other thing is, like Beef talked about, the battle rhythm of the last 30 years, especially in the Air Force. We've been fighting a war in Southwest Asia for 30 years. 30 plus, it was, Desert Storm. The Air Force has been there the whole time, Army and others, Navy as well, but the Army talks about 25 years or so because we went in there and softened the ground for the Army to go in and take Kuwait back. But that battle rhythm has been, just devastating to a family. They're constantly deployed and never see their spouse and kids and those kind of things.
I think people that are not in the military, the families that are not, they don't understand that battle rhythm that you just talked about. And I guess you used to go in and then you got out, then you had a relatively normal life, but that seems to have changed. In all branches of the military.
Well, even in the reserve and guard, you
Right.
expected to have a little less of that type of a deployment structure when you left active duty, but it became even more so because of the requirements needed on the force. The active Air Force can't do it alone. They rely on the Guard and Reserve to be the force multipliers, and we've become more of an operational than a strategic reserve.
Really?
Yeah. And you wanted to talk about that, Rob, so
Yeah.
go ahead.
The other big thing, obviously, just like in the commercial arena, was COVID. COVID was huge. A lot of the training to make military pilots is on the civilian side. Simulator instructors, ground school instructors have been pushed away from the blue suiters because it's too expensive to have those personnel on the rolls for the military. So they outsourced it to contractors. Well, as soon as COVID hit, contractors said, we're staying at home and we're not coming out for a long time. And so if you don't have a ground instructor to teach them the academics on the airplane and do the simulator instruction for them, they can't ever get in the airplane to fly. They're not qualified to go to that next step in the syllabus. So COVID was huge, a barrier, and just like the commercial world. What they're trying to do is throw money at it, but they've been trying to throw money at it since we were in. And they started this in the late 80s and 90s because they saw the flux to the commercial world, and they said, okay, how do we entice these Air Force military pilots to stay? Let's throw them bonuses each year. And each year that you sign up for a commitment, if you extend that out longer and longer, we'll make the bonus go higher. So, it enticed people to go for a 7-year term at a higher bonus annual rate. It hasn't worked. They're up to $50,000 a year right now, and it has never really worked to keep the pilots in and keep our numbers where we want them. They're also now offering kind of good deal assignments. So you take, somebody that's been in places that are remote and can't bring families and those kind of things, you offer them a follow-on assignment that brings them back to Washington, D.C. and the Beltway, and the spouse and family are happy with good schools and those kind of things. That still really hasn't met the mark either.
Do they
And then-
engage you for, I'm sorry for interrupting, but they engage you guys that were former pilots that have been early retired or whatever you want to call it? Do they engage all to say what would it have taken to keep you? Or is this being directed from DC and said, hey, I find it interesting that so many bureaucrats try and dictate solutions to problems when they're not talking to,
I talked to so many airline guys that said they would never have gotten off active duty if they could have just flown airplanes their whole career. And
Really?
unfortunately, there isn't that dual track system that exists. They've tried it, and they've tried different avenues to get to something like that.
because the military couldn't provide the lifestyle that they wanted to have for their family? Is that
No,
what you
they
mean?
just wanted to fly airplanes. They don't want to go sit at a desk and do a desk job, which is encompassed in the progression of a military officer's career, is having to move out of the cockpit into this particular job and maybe get back to the cockpit later on and have to move up more levels of responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. So these guys said, hey, I don't want to do this. I just want to fly airplanes.
But wouldn't that be a solution to keeping some of the military guys in and promising them more flight hours? Did I misunderstand what Beef just said?
No, I had this discussion. I was the aide to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force when I was a major. And so I had this very discussion with him. He looked at me and twiddled his thumbs and listened to my whole argument and didn't say a word when I finished. And so, just like Beef saying, there's a way that they feel, and it's, it might be looking through dinosaur goggles, but there's a progression that they require to groom people for general officer rank. And that includes not only the flying part, but headquarters, staff, schooling, all types of different things that don't involve flying. And most people that get into the flying business are there because they love flying.
Right.
And
When I
so-
first started my career, I was flying C-130s in Japan. We had a guy in our unit that was a 20-year captain. He knew more about that airplane than anybody, even the guys that probably built it. And, you could sit with him and learn some incredible things about the C-130 through his eyes. But he was a dinosaur in terms of the whole progression of being able to fly that long. And I'm not even sure how he was able to stay in 20 years and fly that whole time.
But when you say he's a 20-year captain, after 20 years, should he have been a much higher grade of officer? Is that what
Lieutenant
you-
Colonel.
Should have been a lieutenant colonel.
Okay,
Yeah.
But he decided to stay a captain.
No,
so
he
could fly?
never got promoted. So,
Okay.
and I guess back in those days, there were avenues to be able to keep guys like that around. So it was amazing to have someone like that was available to be able to be an expert in a weapon system to that degree. But this is my opportunity also to brag about the reserve and the guard. A lot of people don't understand the three different components to our Air Force.
Please.
We have an active duty Air Force, which is about 300,000 members, and we have a reserve that's got 70,000, and we've got a guard that's got 105,000. The guard and reserve make up a considerable amount, probably 14% in the reserve and 21% approximately in the guard, make up the requirements for our entire Air Force. And they do it at it used to be about 25 cents on the dollar. And people say, well, how is that? Well, the deal is when you're a reservist or a guardsman, you only get paid when you work.
Right.
Unless you get deployed, and then you're on full-time active duty orders at that point. But when you're not working, you're not getting paid. But you have to maintain the same qualifications that the active duty does. And I'm talking flying, for example. If I'm an F-16 pilot, I have to maintain the exact same requirements that an active duty F-16 pilot does in the reserve or the guard. C-130, the same thing. So they maintain the same qualifications, but they also have another job that they're doing as well. And the value that we get from our reserve and guard is incredible. Probably the most important aspect of it is if you're in the middle of the United States somewhere where there's no other military around you, but there's this Air Force Reserve unit or this Air National Guard unit, and we're getting ready to deploy to war, then people in that neighborhood don't know anything about the military other than, hey, my neighbor's in that unit. So they get an understanding of what we're doing by sending the American soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marine to the middle of the desert to fight some war. They're able to understand it because of their neighbors. And I think that's the most valuable aspect of the Guard and Reserve is the connection with the civilian population.
Did y'all miss active duty when you retired from active duty? Because it sounds like you were just almost as busy.
No, I mean, I think I enjoyed the reserves much more. You got to stay in one place that you wanted to. You usually picked where you wanted to be.
So family life's a little more stable.
Family, both my kids were born and grew up in Miami, where we were stationed at Homestead Air Base. And they got to go through all the school with their friends the whole time. I'm a Air Force brat. I moved all over the place, and every 2-3 years we picked up and moved. So that part of it really wasn't enthusiastic to me to continue that. My brother Jake, who you've had here, I think he moved 23 times in a 35-year career. He had 2 great boys. They made it through, obviously, probably more resilient than mine because they moved every 2 or 3 years and had to pick the boxes up. And
a different kind of resiliency.
Correct. So, that aspect of it, the reserve was much more compatible with my temperament and lifestyle, and my wife's as well. And you got to make sure your spouse is happy. That's a big thing with the reserves too. You have a better chance of making them happy in the reserves, being able to put roots down and they have a community together that they're familiar with and not moving all the time.
Hey, listeners.
Hey, everyone.
Hola.
Hi, all.
Hello, everybody.
Hello, this is Rob Polumbo.
This is Fred Hyde.
This is Juliet Ashley Vide.
Dr. Angela Garcia Falconetti.
This is Congressman Scott Franklin.
This is Margie Grant.
This is Jake Polumbo.
And I want to thank you for listening to Todd's podcast.
Thank you for listening to Todd's podcast.
Thank you for listening to Todd's podcast.
Please make sure that you like and or subscribe.
Don't forget
Don't forget to subscribe to Todd's podcast on your favorite podcast app. Tune in and listen.
Join in and listen to us.
Thanks.
Thank you.
You had mentioned about the 30-year war that we've been dealing with and how that has drained a lot of the resources of pilots of all the disciplines, not just the Air Force. If we got out of the Middle East, I don't know that we ever can, but how long would it take to be not at war, not fully engaged, to build that back up, to get through that cycle again where we start building the bank of pilots back up? Is that something that has ever been discussed? You said it a couple of times about how expensive it was to the number of people that are in the queue, because it's draining. You're not on active duty, but you're darn sure there a lot. That's on the political side, I guess, is, hey, the political solution might be, hey, let's just get out of these things.
But we're not there at the moment.
Right.
We're still having the issues, and we're having the issues because of the things that we've talked about in terms of, the airlines are growing right now. The airlines goes in peaks and valleys, and right now we're seeing the peaks. We're seeing great opportunities for young pilots to go to the airline and make a lot of money. So they see that as an opportunity to do well financially. The military is really not at war at the moment, at least the Air Force isn't.
Right.
Obviously we have people over there, but we're not at war. So to your point, we do have time to rebuild. The problem is the recruiting. The academies are doing well.
That was another question I was going to say. Are all the academies full?
The academies are full.
Okay.
But when you start talking about the enlisted force, and you're essentially there's a huge deficit, And not only that, 23% of those that are joining can't meet the or there's 23% that can't meet the physical requirements of the that are required to be a military individual.
Are there programs to coach those 23% up? I know you have a kid that may go off to college. It's not quite where they need to be math, and they've got some math classes to help get their math scores up to where they are college level math to start into that program.
Well, it was a prep school. I went to the prep school before I
Right.
went to the Air Force Academy, and
and you beat up on Robert. When
well,
he was,
yeah, but
that
was
built
an
your body up.
extracurricular activity. But the prep school was an opportunity to do just as you said. I didn't do as well on my verbal
Okay.
SAT that I needed to, so it was an opportunity to build your score and get an get an academy opportunity to go to the academy after that.
Right, but
So-
couldn't they do that on the physical side? I mean, is that what boot camp is, or how do we
Well,
build
that
these
was-
young men and women's bodies up?
But I was physically qualified to get to the academy.
Right.
It was the academic aspect of it. We've got 23% of our population that can't meet the physical requirements to even get into the military. So that becomes a stickling point in terms of being able to recruit. And that's part of the recruiting problem is that alone.
And remember, officer enlisted, much different animals. Like we talked about, there's 13,000 plus qualified applicants that put in for each of the service academies: West Point, Annapolis, Merchant Marine, Coast Guard Academy, and Air Force Academy.
For about 1,100
For
positions.
for 1,100. So there's no problem in the officer ranks.
Okay.
The enlisted ranks are 82% of our military. And so that's the recruiting shortfall. Okay. We need 150,000 new recruits a year across all of our military. That's a lot of folks. And if you have only 23% from 17 to 24 years old that even meet the minimum qualification, then out of that group, you got to have people that raise their hand and want to go through a boot camp. You have to be qualified before you go to the boot camp. They don't bring you into the boot camp unless you're physically qualified prior to that. So there's, this different generations, different economy. When the economy's strong, like it has vice inflation. I mean, there's jobs available. There's,
Right.
We're not in
There's
a
opportunities.
recession. Then the people that raise their hand in that group are falling. And so last year, 2023, we had a 41,000 person shortfall out of 150 that we needed.
Of all the military.
So that's 27% or so that we missed our goal. And so you talking about the services now are up in arms. They can't have that go and that advertised like that, because more will go, oh, I'm not getting into that. It sounds like a losing proposition. You know what I mean? You don't want bad press. And so they've done a lot to try and get into the schools, get into communities, all these different things. But it's a tough road. It's going to be a tough road for the next decade, as far as I can tell, because if you have a strong economy, there are other things to do. You don't have a huge commitment.
There's
You
options.
can bounce around, and that's what these newer generations, they like bouncing around, right? They go from job to job to job to progress.
Right.
They don't sit for 20 plus years. That's not these generations that we're talking about like to do.
So what's the answer to the draft?
That's a discussion point, but then you don't have a professional military force the way we do today. And I think Rob corrected me. When I talk about the 23%, that's 23% of those that are trying to get into the military meet the physical requirements.
Oh, okay. So I thought they did not meet.
No,
So
23%. 23% do not.
So 77% don't meet.
Don't meet the qualifications.
Wow. So I mentioned the draft. Maybe it's some type of draft for volunteer service, and then you let these young men and women get a taste of it, and maybe more of them say, hey, I like this part of my life. This is good for me. Maybe you get a few more. I don't know.
But prior to having an all volunteer force, you got people into the military that probably shouldn't have been in the military. A judge says, hey, you either go to the military or you go to jail.
Right. But if you have a 1 year commitment or whatever, does that kind of weed those people out, or is it too expensive to have that many people that aren't committed?
Well, in today's era, from the Air Force perspective, you've got high technologically advanced systems that you're dealing with. Do you want somebody that had problems with the law where the judge
Right.
says you need to go join the military or go to jail, and you want him working on that stuff? Probably not. Him or her.
About 2.1 million in our military right now, currently. Less than 1% of our total population, right? Of that, 60% of that less than 1% that are in our military are family members that re-up generationally. 60%. So this funnel is so tiny of who is in our military these days. If you had a draft, how would you pick? How would you choose? Who would you direct? And there's so many special interest groups now. How would you delineate? If one didn't want to do it because of this reason or that reason, think of the angst and the chaos, right? Because it's not World War II at the moment,
Right.
where we need millions and millions, tens of millions, right, to come into the ranks.
Right.
We only need 2 million out of 320 million or so, right? So how do you fairly direct who I'm going to conscript? How do you do that? And I'm not going to get into the political nightmare of that, but
Right.
Well, it's like the COVID vaccine. You know, when we got in, you bent over and got the shots they gave you. You didn't
Yeah.
question it. Today, they question it.
Yeah.
So trying to force someone into the military might be problematic in today's society.
So it doesn't sound like there's a short-term easy fix. It's got to be a long-range plan. And what I heard you say earlier is the airlines are starting to try and grow their own pilots. The airlines, I know the ground people, the mechanics are growing their own so they can fix the planes that you guys fly. How does
let me hit that point right there.
Okay.
That, for me, is the biggest, highest priority for the military side of it, is to have good working aircraft, a parts supply that keeps that aircraft going daily. We call it fully mission capable.
Okay.
And our fully mission capable rate of all of our military aircraft across the board averages about 60 to 70%, meaning 6 of 10 airplanes work that day. And so if you only have that many, and we're diminished, the Air Force has gone from 9,200 aircraft in about 1990 down to, we're going to go below 5,000 aircraft this year,
All aircraft.
2024. Air Force.
Right. I mean, all Air Force aircraft.
Right. Fighters, tankers, airlifters, all of that. So think of how many airframes have come down, right? And then you say that only 6 of 10 of those work on a daily basis. Now, you just look at how momentous that glide path is. It's a downward glide path. How can you train more pilots if your airplanes don't work, effectively every day? You got to have the airplane. The airplane's the most important thing if you want to train a pilot.
Right.
And so that's the one thing that I can't see a lot of focus. I know they throw money at it in the budget. We get an $860 billion a year budget in the military. We put money at it, but there's not really, I think, enough direction that is the key. The key is to get those airplanes working.
And out of that budget, mind you, there's a huge portion of that goes to military personnel, goes to paychecks and retirements and medical and all those. It leaves very small portion of it for the operational capability. So it's very difficult to manage an operational military with the percentages that are there designed for the whole military, but a large portion is going to the military individuals that are working in those areas. So,
and the retirees that you're looking at right here, So from now to 2040, we're $1 trillion underwater for paying all of that stuff for all of our gear and training and being prepared, and all of us veterans that are not on the rolls anymore. We're 1 trillion in the water, underwater. Okay, with 860 billion coming in each year, we're $1 trillion behind. And so that's what we're up against. That's all the deficit spending. That's all the things that, those are the political realms of the decisions that are being made by our government.
Hey everybody, this is your host Todd Dantzler, and I hope you're enjoying this episode. I would like to take a moment to do a shameless plug for my real estate business. As most of you know, I'm a partner with SVN Saunders Ralston Dantzler Real Estate, but I am also a working broker who is very active in listing and selling real estate. I've been in this business for over 41 years. I know, you're thinking he can't be, he's so young looking, but no, it's true. I've been actively listing and selling commercial real estate my entire working career on properties ranging from ag land to multifamily projects to office and commercial and industrial properties. I have held the distinguished CCIM designation since 1991. This is the highest designation you can achieve in the commercial real estate field. I believe that a big part of my success in the real estate business is because of the relationships that I have fostered throughout the state of Florida and also right here in Polk County. So if you have any real estate needs in buying or selling, please give me a call to see if I can help out. My direct line to my desk is 863-877-2846. Again, that's 863-877-2846. So the last 40 or 50 minutes have just created so many more questions in my head. Is there someone, somewhere, some think tank that is trying to solve the big picture, or is everything just incremental and we hope that enough incremental change will do the big picture?
I think we got the right people in the right places, but they're overwhelmed with, these resolutions because we can't get a budget. Right. As soon as a continuing resolution happens, the military shuts down. All they do is pay the bills, must pay bills. They don't get any more, new contracts, added on extra aircraft like F-35s.
Research and development, all that stuff.
All of that stuff stops. And now it's like that, like we've talked about. When you stop something, it takes twice as long to get it back going. And so they never are in sync to get anything going for a long period of time. And if you've neglected maintenance of aircraft for a long period of time, it's going to take 2 or 3 times the length to get it back up to speed. And we've never dealt with it. We've never had a 5 to 10 year period where we've had stable budgets that get signed on the appropriate dates and those kind of things. So that's the function.
It's the politics.
But you've got smart people that know this, but they're overwhelmed and they just throw their hands up. They don't know what to do. There's no way to fight this bureaucracy of how we do budgeting and pay bills and those kind of things.
So do the citizens just start beating on the door of our
That'd be a good
appropriators, i.e. congressmen, leadership, and say, hey,
do your job.
Do your job. And when they come to town halls, they do your job. And do your research and find out who is trying to do their job and who are standing in the way. And I think there are probably people on both sides that are committed to being in the way, not just one side or the other. So it's up to us to help carry the message for the military and say, quit playing games with this. Start at least pulling that portion out. And let's getting on, like you've said a couple of times, a glide path to getting back to where we're prosperous and we have the resources, and that the smart people can start planning these things and not going quarter to quarter, year to year, and hoping, I can't imagine trying to plan long term when you've only got 1 year commitments.
This is, I can't, you can visualize this, but it's the Xerox in our book.
Right.
Everybody is looking at Xerox. They never have a chance to go, let's do some far rocks decisions, because all they're trying to do is get through the day, the week, the month.
But the far rocks is equally, if not more important than the near rocks. A lot of people can handle the near rocks. The far rocks are what Congress and the appropriators need to be looking at, and let maybe the military look at the near rocks.
Well, they ought to start compromising and do what's right for all Americans rather than
Yeah.
being so, nearsighted.
I think they ought to, you pilots should figure out a way to get a two-seater, take these guys up one at a time and scare the crap out of them and say, hey, I need a commitment. Or fly them into Tegucigalpa and say, hey, I learned this because of the time in the military. Beef, you had made a comment about how complicated the weapon systems are these days in that part of the training. Is it harder to learn the weapon system than it is to fly the actual plane? That the weapons have gotten so complicated.
Well, let me put it this way, share a story. When I transitioned from the 727 in the commercial world to the 757, 767, which was a totally different way of flying airplanes, there were a lot of guys that couldn't make it through the program, that were old timers that had been flying DC-9s and back in the old days, DC-8s, 727s, and then they go to this modern technologically advanced airplane where now you're doing a lot of the flying by punching into the computer. It was very difficult for them to learn, and they couldn't do it. So young kids today don't have any problem because they've been around iPads and computers their whole lives, and it's an easier way for them to transition. But if you're an old guy and you were flying basic gauges, and now you're into this complex aircraft, which is all advanced push buttons, computer generated, it's a little more difficult to learn. And I don't know if you had the same experience.
Absolutely. All the folks that I talk to in the fighter community that are flying F-22s, F-35s, our newest fighters.
Right.
The airplane's a dream to fly, very easy, no issues with that. But being able to task manage everything that is coming in, the information overload, if you will, is the most dominant thing that you've got to train to on a daily basis to get really good at.
Is the development of the unmanned drones, is that part of the solution, do you think, for pilot shortages? I would think there's certain missions that you guys have to be behind the stick.
Yes and no.
Right.
I think we're going that way, and eventually you're going to see that. But the amount of people that you have to have on the ground
Right.
is more than what it was needed just to have a single pilot go up and fly an airplane. Now, the cost factors include human factors. You don't have to have an ejection seat anymore. You don't have to have all the fancy gauges, oxygen, all that kind of stuff. So there's a huge savings there. But as I said, you got more people on the ground that are having to facilitate that operation. Didn't you say, Rob?
Yeah, and another thing, they're allowing in the Air Force enlisted people now to control remotely piloted aircraft.
Because they've grown up with joysticks or something? Or
because of pilot shortages. And so
Shortages.
now if you open it up to 82% of our military are enlisted now, the Army has always had warrant officers and those kind of things that are in a rank between enlisted and officer that have flown helicopters and a number of other things. Air Force just opened that up, a warrant officer career field.
Well, we used to have it years ago,
Yes,
apparently. In
so-
Vietnam era, they did away with it. I'm not sure when, but
Yes.
they did away with the warrant officer program, and they just recently brought it back.
Absolutely. And we also have an enlisted corps that flies some, right now, non-lethal drones, meaning they don't shoot weapons or anything like that. So I think that will open up as well and could alleviate pilot shortage issues.
But the soldier that's flying the drone, do they typically have their finger on the weapons as well? Or is it you got a pilot flying it and then you got another
Normally,
group of people that are looking at the weapon system and saying, hey, this is how we get this bomb or this shell right on where we need it to go?
absolutely. And normally it's a two-seat console with a aircraft commander, meaning the commander of the aircraft flying it and putting it in the position that it needs to be and communicating with headquarters. And then there's a weapons system operator that covers all the sensors and putting weapons.
The backseat guy.
Well, they're side by each
Right,
in
right,
a console.
right,
But
but-
the old,
Yeah.
F4 type of thing, that's a two-person concept, if you will, of a weaponized drone.
Do you think that's the future of where we're going? Is it part of the future? It sounds like it's gaining a bigger and bigger percentage of how we're going to be fighting warfare in the very near future and maybe the far out future. Do you think that's...
We're already there. Over 50% of the Air Force, the aircraft fleet, including the personnel and everything, is on unmanned aircraft.
From a fighter perspective and being a fighter pilot, how do you feel about that?
I think it's very, realistic for the 21st century and beyond. Like you've already talked about. I mean, you can put a whole another bladder of fuel where I was going to be. You can put more weapons on because of, my weight, the ejection seat and everything associated with keeping me alive. I think it's essential, and it's going to flow by the mission. And so there are certain missions that lend itself to that. And so that's where we're going into initially. And the first thing you look at is risk. So if it's very high risk, you want drones to go into that environment instead of humans because we don't want casualties, right? So, but it's going to evolve. And quite frankly, it could be at some point 100%. Now, space is the new technology or, the new frontier. And so we're seeing quite a bit unmanned activities in that area, but you'll see them have manned missions that they always will want on that. And so it'll just be a pick and choose on what's the smartest thing with minimizing risk to humans.
So we've been talking for right at an hour, and I appreciate it very much. So we'll go ahead and wrap this up. And we had a whole page of topics, and we've talked about 1.5.
I can't believe we're not going to talk about the Middle East or China.
We'll have y'all back if you'd like to talk about that later. We can go longer if you would like. But it sounds like there's always going to, I shouldn't say always, it seems like in the near future, there's always going to have to be one of you folks, an active or a live pilot at some point putting live eyes on the situation on the ground and not just drones. I mean,
the airline business, we talked about the military exclusively for that. The airline, I see it right now, we've got humans in the cockpit. I could see the next stage of that being one human, okay? And then that human at some point will go back in a crew rest bunk in the aircraft and wait for the bell to go off that there's something that they can't handle on the ground. And once that redundancy and proven success happens, then you may have just a door there, locked up that nobody goes into unless you get it on the ground and maintenance gets in there. So but the holdback is the passengers. Because,
Are you going to get on an airplane?
The old dinosaurs like us are going to go, I'm not getting on an airplane with nobody up there.
Right.
But the kids, they go, I don't care about that. I do video games across the globe. I can do all that from the ground. So it's generational.
maybe if one of you or two in the seat next to me, I might be thinking about it, but it is unnerving to think, okay, the two guys that are supposed to be in the front are right here next to me having a soft drink or a beer. And, you know, you don't seem to be nervous about it. And I do know that a lot of times when I fly, I look at the flight attendant, and if they're not freaking out, then I don't give too much credence to the turbulence or whatever. But when they sit down and put the seatbelt on, it's like, oh crap, this isn't going to be any fun. So,
We have really gotten risk adverse about turbulence as well. Back when we first started, you know, you wouldn't turn that seatbelt sign on unless it was really bad. Today, as soon as you feel a bump, the captain's turning the seatbelt sign on and making sure that there are no issues.
can you see it on the radar? Because turbulence
No, you can't see it.
can't.
You hear it being relayed from other aircraft in front of you that they've just penetrated some turbulent areas. You might be able to, if you did enough planning, you might be able to see the winds and determine that there might be an area. You can go to your flight plan, and your flight plan will indicate there might be an area up front there's going to be turbulence, but by the time you get there, it might have dissipated. And then there's areas where it's not on your flight plan that all of a sudden you get turbulence, and now you're having to react.
So you can't see it on a radar and say, I'm running late, I got to go right through it, or hey, I got extra time, I'm going to fly around it, over it, or under it?
Not turbulence.
Okay.
Now, if it's related to thunderstorms, you can see the thunderstorms on
Right.
your radar, but just clear air turbulence, you can't see it. It's either reported or it was formulated in your flight plan that you may see it at this point in the route.
That's what bothers me more than anything else, is bouncing up and down in those planes. I said, at some point, that rivet's going to pop out. Is there anything I haven't asked you guys about this? I mean, we've covered this subject pretty well. I got a whole sheet of other stuff that I hope you'll come back and that you enjoyed the experience today, and I hope the listeners will enjoy it. But I do thank you, General Haddad, General Polumbo. Thank you for your service. Thank you for what you do for us. And these guys have written a couple of books, Leadership from 30,000 feet and Leadership from 100 feet. It's at twoblueaces.com, or the books are $10 or something like that at Amazon. And they both do leadership training and executive training. And I know these guys personally, and you couldn't find two better individuals.
Here's a marketing plug.
Please.
I'm writing my third book, this one by myself. And it should be out middle of next year, From the Ejection Seat.
Oh my God.
You wanna read these.
Okay.
What's the title?
From the Ejection Seat.
Ejection Seat. Very good.
Did they have ejection seats in your planes, Beef, or did they just?
Yeah, well, the T-38, when I went through training, and the T-37.
Okay.
Problem with the T-37 is my knee was under. No, my knee. No, different story. My knee was under the release for the gear, an emergency gear extension.
Right.
And if we had to eject, my knee was under that thing. I would have taken my knee out with it when I went when I had to eject. But yeah, I've sat in ejection seats. So
Wow.
it's kind of cool.
Amazing. Well, thank you all very much for coming in, Eli. I appreciate you running the board again for us. And if you like this episode, let us know. We've got a couple other episodes planned with Noobs and Sparky and Jake and Larry. And hopefully we'll be able to get to some of the topics that we didn't get to today. But I appreciate your service. Thank you for coming in. And lunch is on me, fellas.
Todd, thanks again. Thanks for the opportunity to come out and come to Lakeland and see you and get out of my retirement routine.
Get off the pickleball court.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Always good to come back to my roots here in Central Florida. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. I want to thank you for listening to Todd's podcast. This has been your host, Todd Dantzler. If you enjoyed this episode, I hope you'll tune in next time for when we talk to Brian Haas, our state attorney for District or Circuit 10. We're going to talk about his office, how they approach prosecutions, plea deals, and some other interesting things that will happen, and what they go through with dealing with their stress load and their caseload. So I hope you'll join us for the episode with Brian Haas, which is coming up. As always, don't forget to rate, review, follow, and subscribe to Todd's podcast on your favorite podcast app. If you have any questions for me or any suggestions for future guests, please call or text our number at 863-288-0944 or visit todddantzler.com. Again, that's 863-288-0944, or visit my website, todddantzler.com. I look forward to hearing your questions and feedback, and please take care.